So I'm Wendy Kohlman. I am the director of the Genetic Counseling Shared Resource at Princeton Cancer Institute. I don't know if I have anything to declare other than that it is my job to talk to women about their risk of breast cancer. So that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming at this issue from. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I have been working in the field of cancer genetics for over 16 years now, and when I started off in the field, the idea of clinical genetic testing was still relatively new, particularly for common conditions like cancer. And when I started off, I really felt like I spent about half my time counseling patients and evaluating their risk and making recommendations, and the other half of my time figuring out how to get a test done. Just dealing with the logistical issues of what lab even offered the test, how to get a sample to them, how to get the insurance company to pay for it. I got married shortly after starting my first job, and with every crate and barrel plate setting I got in the mail, I excitedly took the styrofoam back to work to use to ship blood samples out. That was, starting off in genetic testing, we had limited resources. But Myriad had a huge impact coming into the field. And they really seemed to set out to remove the logistical barriers associated with genetic testing and put the focus back on identifying high-risk patients and providing them counseling and management. Myriad's impact on clinical practice really kind of stems from their clinical operation. Like I said, they eliminated a lot of the logistical barriers. They gave us these boxes that had everything we needed in them, which is good because I've still been married this whole time, so I didn't really want to have to go through that again to get more shipping supplies. Also, they went to extensive negotiations with insurers and helped educate insurers about genetic testing, and got contracts and got this to be something that was covered for patients. And Myriad also took care of a lot of the billing issues, which allowed us once again to focus on taking care of patients and not feeling like we needed to have a separate degree in business management in order to order a genetic test. Myriad also increased awareness of genetic testing and hereditary breast and ovarian cancer. How many times today have you already heard someone say BRCA? I don't know of any other genes that have a catchy name. The genes are BRCA1 and 2. BRCA is the name of Myriad's test for those genes. But regardless of what you call it, physicians know about it. There was a study done by the CDC back in 2005, at which that time 40% of physicians still thought that a risk for breast cancer couldn't come through the father. But by 2011, 93% of physicians were aware of BRCA testing, and in women's health specialties, 100% of OBGYNs were aware of BRCA1 and 2 and the availability of testing. And about 30% of physicians have ordered a BRCA test on at least one patient, probably making it one of the most commonly ordered genetic tests through probably one of the widest ranges of medical specialties. Excuse me. I want to fully acknowledge that Myriad has made huge contributions to the area of clinical cancer genetics. They've made a lot of aspects of my job a lot easier. But I want to point out some issues that we've encountered in our clinic where we feel like having only one lab doing the test has also limited the options for patient care and maybe affected some outcomes. So the first patient is a 37-year-old woman who was diagnosed with an invasive ductal breast cancer. She had neoadjuvant chemotherapy and then ended up having a mastectomy and radiation. Due to her young age, she was offered genetic testing of the BRCA1 and 2 genes. This was in 2008 that she was seen. At that time, Myriad was offering their standard test, which was sequencing, which looks at just the letters of the genetic code. But there are other types of genetic changes that we call rearrangements, like where a big chunk of the gene is missing or there's extra genetic material inserted. And these types of genetic changes are actually really hard to find. Myriad's standard test involved sequencing and looking for 5 common rearrangements. Starting in 2007, 2008, Myriad began offering wider range testing for these rearrangements, but only to patients who met certain criteria. So my patient, like I said, she had breast cancer at a young age. Her paternal grandmother had breast cancer, but she had a very small family. Parents were only children. She only had a brother, so there wasn't much else there. And she did not meet Myriad's criteria to have the comprehensive rearrangement testing included as part of her test. She already had paid about $800 out of pocket for her original BRCA testing, and when I explained to her she would need to pay $800 to get the rest of the genetic testing, she said no. She was pretty overwhelmed with her new diagnosis. We had recommended that she continue to have careful follow-up after her treatment, and 3 years later, she had a screening MRI that identified a contralateral breast cancer. Even though she had been having regular screening, the cancer was still detected at a stage in which she was going to need chemotherapy and another mastectomy. So this was absolutely devastating for a young mother who had just spent a lot of time undergoing treatment while her children were young, and now facing that same situation all over again. This time, we did encourage her to go ahead with the comprehensive rearrangement testing, and now with her new diagnosis, she met criteria, and her insurance would pay for that testing for her. And we did find that she had a large deletion in BRCA1, which had not been found the first time around, and she had opted for mastectomy, bilateral mastectomy. The second cancer treatment could have been avoided. So this type of comprehensive rearrangement testing, just to put this in context, the technology to look for these had been available for years. The Mayo Clinic started offering this for a similar condition, Lynch syndrome, in 2004. So basically every other gene that we had tests for in our hereditary clinic had this type of testing available along with sequencing for several years. When Myriad did decide to start offering this type of testing, it wasn't until 2007, and then they went about it in such a way in which they set a criteria. If your patient didn't need it, they would often have to pay extra to have that done. And patients were often unwilling or unable to do that. These types of changes account for about 3% of the mutations in BRCA in Caucasians, but maybe up to as much as 20% in the Hispanic population. So it's actually been until about the last year in which now Myriad routinely includes the rearrangement testing with their sequencing as one test, so insurers pay one price. And so it's taken almost a decade longer for BRCA to have this incorporated compared to other conditions like Lynch syndrome. So, there's been a lot of discussion about, about whether or not the sequence is patented or what part of this the argument is about. But even if you know the sequence of the gene, if you aren't using the right technology to detect the mutations in a given patient, knowing the reference sequence is worthless and has no clinical value in and of itself. It must be paired with the appropriate clinical technology. My next patient was a 42-year-old who had ductal carcinoma in situ at age 42. She then was diagnosed with endometrial cancer at age 47. She had other unique things in her medical history. She had a tongue papilloma, she had hypothyroidism, and she had a much larger than average head size. Nothing striking in her family history, but her own personal history was quite suspicious of a hereditary predisposition. And BRCA1 and 2 are not the only genes that cause a risk for breast cancer. There are actually lots of other genes. Another example is P10, which is a gene associated with breast cancer, thyroid, endometrial cancer, and several non-cancerous features. She met the classic kind of features of P10, hematoma syndrome. We frequently see patients who have histories that overlap conditions, that look like, that there is evidence of a hereditary risk for breast cancer. BRCA1 and 2 obviously are genes on our differential, but there are other genes that we need to think about as well. The National Comprehensive Cancer Network recommends that any woman diagnosed with breast cancer under age 35 have testing not only of BRCA1 and 2, but of the p53 gene, which is another common cause of hereditary breast cancer in very, very young women. At this point, up until the Supreme Court decision and other labs kind of jumping into the BRCA arena, to get all these tests done, it was exactly what Lynn and Ben have been alluding to, of going from multiple labs and going back to insurers over and over again, asking them to pay for another test. This was time-consuming and costly. And the ability with next generation sequencing is just even increasing our ability to cheaply and efficiently run all these possible genes at the same time. So for this patient, when we explained to the insurance company that her features were consistent of this condition caused by P10, they indicated that they thought that was experimental, but they had definitely heard of the BRCA1 and 2 test, and they would pay for that for her. And we were able to order that as a part of a next generation sequencing panel that included BRCA1 and 2 as well as the P10 gene, and we found her mutation. And this test cost the same price as BRCA testing alone. So patient 3 was another woman diagnosed with breast cancer in her 40s, successfully treated, but she had really difficult to examine breasts, and she frequently had abnormal mammograms requiring biopsies. This had really heightened her anxiety, and she was incredibly anxious about her breast cancer risk. Her family history was also really quite unique. Her father had died from breast cancer at 75. He came from a large family. He had a brother with pancreatic cancer. So in looking at this family, seeing her young breast cancer and male breast cancer in the family, that's definitely suggestive of a hereditary risk. On the other hand, I can't remember the exact number, she has like 50 or 60 cousins on that side of the family. There were no other cancers, so you were really one of these families. Was this just 2 incidences of bad luck, or is this a family with a high-risk mutation? She was seen in 2011. Her insurance did not cover any genetic testing. They completely excluded the cost of testing. So this patient paid the full price of the testing out of pocket herself. And she received back a result, which I can't remember either Elaine or Ben had alluded to this, the dreaded variant of uncertain significance. So Myriad, all that they would provide us as far as information about this variant is that they had seen it in that they had seen it previously in 4 families. And they told us the ethnic breakdown of those families. It looks like from this report that they probably tested about 17 total members from these families, but they didn't provide us any information about whether or not this variant was found to segregate with cancers within the family, or anything about the strength of the history in these families. So variants of uncertain significance, we get these in about 3 to 5% of BRCA test results. And once again, the rate of finding a variant goes up dramatically for non-European populations. There are many factors and many different approaches that you can take into account in trying to classify a variant or determine whether or not it's related to cancer risk or if it's just part of human variation. Myriad has a very strong program for doing this. They have done a very good job and have very high standards for how they make these calls. But they don't share their internal information either with patients or with the international research community that is trying to work on this. This is just a comparison here between the Myriad report versus the 2 pages of information that we got from a BRCA variant identified through another laboratory. This other commercial laboratory also shares all of their variant data with international research consortiums that are pooling together experts from all over the world to try to answer these questions. Now I want to be clear that regardless of if the lab is sending you 1 page or 2 pages, it's still a variant. Neither lab could classify what the issue was, but it's a bit of a matter of philosophy of my patient, when I showed her her report and was trying to explain to her what this meant, she said, okay, I get it. Did any of these families have a man with breast cancer? I'm like, I don't know. She's like, well, did the mutation follow with, the people in the family who have cancer? I'm like, I don't know. And she's like, okay, like, I get it, they don't know, but I paid $3,000. Don't I deserve to know what they know? And I said, well, some people would think so. So there's a different philosophies on this, and lots of different pros and cons to different ways of classifying variants. But we've kind of taken the approach of, it takes a village. We want everyone's brain in the world who's interested in thinking about variants to help with this issue, and we like the idea of sharing. So the final point that I wanted to make is regarding to access. So I highlighted the fact that people are becoming very aware of the BRCA1 and 2 genes and hereditary breast cancer, but these tests are still underutilized. We recently completed a population-based study here in Utah, and through that study, we identified that only about 30% of Utah breast and ovarian cancer patients meeting guidelines for genetic testing have had it. Another study done in Pennsylvania found that Pennsylvania was doing a little bit better than we are, but still pretty abysmal, with only about half the women being tested. So we really agree with Myriad's efforts to market this test and increase awareness. But our vision or thoughts on how best to do that are maybe not always completely aligned. We do not think that a genetic test alone is going to improve outcomes. We think that genetic testing needs to be paired with education and counseling and support. When we look at community physicians' knowledge about genetic testing, studies have shown that their self-reported knowledge and confidence in genetics is low. There have been several studies showing that physicians may order incorrect tests or misinterpret results, particularly those variants of uncertain significance. And we have a whole breadth of literature showing positive outcomes from genetic testing, both psychological and medical improvements. But those have all been done in the context of programs that combine the testing with comprehensive counseling. So, at Huntsman, our mission has been to, increase access to genetic testing. And we've been doing this through research. We had an R01 funded grant that provided free genetic counseling to over 900 women in Utah. We've traveled all over the state to places I bet most of you have never been to. And in fact, the patient that I presented with the variant, she was seen as part of this study in Castledale, Utah. So, so we are doing lots of research on the outcomes of BRCA testing. Some of you may have seen the study or the article in the Salt Lake Tribune about the legacy study, where we're looking at the daughters of women who are BRCA mutation carriers to see what factors we can look at early in life to modify their cancer risk. We collaborate with international variant classification programs like Enigma. So, this is kind of our message to the community. And like I said, that may not always jive with Myriad's mission or message, which is really focused on the ordering of genetic testing and maybe in isolation of some of these other resources. So, I guess my conclusions are that, a strong commercial interest in a specific gene, has led to efficient testing approaches, widespread efforts to increase hereditary breast and ovarian cancer awareness. But however, restricting access to a single gene, to a single lab, we've also seen that is hindering the improvement of technologies. Like I said before, the sequence, who cares if you know the sequence? If you can't analyze that sequence and provide someone specific information about whether or not they have a mutation in it, that sequence, just knowing the reference sequence of the average human, is of no clinical value. next generation sequencing is only going to compound this issue. If every gene ended up being patented, the fact that we now have, as Ken had shown, I mean, we can look at your whole genome for a fraction of the cost, and that's going to be completely, all those technology advances are going to be completely useless if we can't synthesize that and look at all those genes and report all the available information back to patients. The issue of variance is only going to become larger, and if labs are not sharing their data, then we're never going to solve this problem. And so collaboration is really needed from that standpoint. And then the final point is that, when you have one entity that sells the product and does the education, that really blurs the distinction between education and marketing. And that's something that, once again, that's why we call it the bracket genes, right? So I think those are my points.